Hi, this is a follow-up to my previous video about information. It was suggested by another user that possibly some clarification about the two concepts of information theory was required, just to make it a little bit easier to understand the distinctions that I was drawing in the previous video. So what I'm actually going to do is pretty much quote verbatim a post from the Richard Dawkins forum by the user JustATheory, who came up with quite possibly the best description of the distinction that I've so far come across. I'll stick a link to the original post in the sidebar, and you can have a look at that if you wish. But this is basically just for information purposes to clarify what I was talking about in the previous video. So this is JustATheory's post. There are actually two very distinct concepts of information. The first, and perhaps the most famous one, comes from a paper written by Shannon entitled A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Some key points from this are as follows. 1. Information content of a message is independent of the meaning of that message. 2. Information entropy can be represented as a decrease in the uncertainty of the observer. 3. A repetitive message thus contains less information than a purely random one. 4. The point of communication is to transmit a message. And 5. While under some circumstances noise can be an information source, it can only ever decrease the information content of a message. So this is the Shannon theory, and it's often referred to as classical information theory. Let's leave that for a second and look at another information theory. Algorithmic information theory is based off the work of Kolmogorov, and a brief description of this is provided. Kolmogorov defined the complexity of a string X as the length of its shortest description P on a universal Turing machine. In other words, a string is simple if it can be described by a short program, like the string of 1,000,000 ones, and is complex if there is no such short description, like for a random string whose shortest description is specifying it bit by bit. Kolmogorov complexity is a key concept in algorithmic information theory. An important property of K is that it's nearly independent of the choice of view. Furthermore, it leads to shorter codes than any other effective code. K shares many properties with Shannon's entropy information measure S, but K is superior to S in many respects. To be brief, K is an excellent universal complexity measure, suitable, for example, for quantifying Occam's razor. The major drawback of K as complexity measure is incomputability, so in practical applications it always has to be approximated, e.g. by MML, MDL or Lempel-Ziv compression or others. Now, it took me a few goes to understand the distinction between the two, so I'll do my best to explain it here in case anyone's feeling as thick as I was when I read this stuff. I know how the user feels when I use Shannon information theory in my day-to-day work, and it took me quite a while to get the distinction with Kolmogorov information. Anyway, moving on with his post. Kolmogorov's definition maximises the information content of a message when the randomness is greatest, i.e. if a message is sufficiently random that every single bit of it must be specified individually and it cannot be simplified, then it contains the highest amount of Kolmogorov information. Thus, making a message more random always increases information under that definition. By contrast, Shannon, in point 5 above, explicitly specifies that noise, i.e. randomness, can only ever decrease the information content of the message. Now, the two seem irreconcilable until you understand the distinction. Shannon information theory starts with a message and considers the effects of noise on that message. In a Shannon system, the information content can never increase beyond the initial state. By contrast, in a Kolmogorov system, the randomness is the information, and thus there is no upper bound on the amount of information in the system. Now, what he's actually talking about here, just to digress for a second, is that Shannon information theory deals with signal integrity. This is what I was talking about in the earlier video. Shannon deals with signal integrity. In other words, where noise is introduced into a system, the information content in Shannon terms is decreased because it increases the uncertainty of the observer. Kolmogorov information, on the other hand, deals with information storage, and therefore the more bits it takes to represent the information, the more information there is. So when you introduce noise into a signal, the Shannon information decreases, but the Kolmogorov information actually increases because it becomes more random. So moving on again with Just a Theory's post. The bait and switch of the creationist comes from using the Shannon mutations always decrease information truism and applying it to a Kolmogorov system like DNA. More formally, for the creationists to use the Shannon definition in their arguments, they must demonstrate that the information content of DNA was maximal and time directed, i.e. that the original DNA molecule had all the information it was ever possible to have. Now, of course, they claim this to be true because of the fall, but there are A, no rigorous proofs of such, and B, substantial evidence against the concept. The evidence comes from the presence of endogenous retroviral insertions into the genome of various species that are conserved across those species. E.g., there's an article here, which I'll put a link to in the sidebar, that demonstrates that retroviral elements have been inserted into all primates and that some of them are conserved across species. This means that information has been added to the original message because the length of the original message has been increased in a non-repetitive manner, as per points 1 and 3 of Shannon's original formulation. This demonstrable addition of information utterly eviscerates the creationist misuse of information theory, as it refutes their Shannon definition by showing that information can actually increase because Shannon clearly states that information is independent of meaning. I'm going to skip a bit now because it moves. So here's another one that's another portion that's very interesting and applicable. It's worthwhile to note exactly why English is such a poor analogue of DNA. In other words, why DNA can't really be treated as a language in the same context. First of all, DNA is redundant. Triplet codons often have a redundancy at the third position. The analogue here is the removal of the vowels from the sentence, "the enemy is now attacking." It makes it hard to read, but it can be deciphered. Similarly, ATT, GTT, GGT codes for isoleucine, valine, and glycine, just the same as ATC, GTC, and GGC does. Secondly, DNA is context independent. The bull is now motivating doesn't make sense. It doesn't even convey a portion of the message, even though it contains a noun and a verb in the correct positions above, whereas ATT, GTT, GAA would still make relative sense because it codes for isoleucine, valine, and glutamic acid, where glue is an acceptable substitute for gly because they're both acidic residues. Thirdly, the order of English is relatively unimportant. We've all listened to the non-native speakers like Yoda, who come out with sentences such as "attacking is the enemy now," which is completely jumbled but able to be parsed. By contrast, GGT, ATT, GTT would code for glycine, isoleucine, valine, which might destroy the active site of a protein. So what does all this mean? The redundancy of DNA means that random mutation can add information. The context independence means that mutations might only have a small local effect, and the importance of order gives a strong intrinsic error checking algorithm. DNA is nearly the perfect information transmittal system for harnessing noise into useful channels. So, as we can see, there are two very clear formulations of information theory, one of which deals with signal integrity, and one of which deals with information storage. And if you look at the way that DNA operates, it's clear that DNA is a Kolmogorov information system. In other words, it deals with information storage, and that many mutations can actually constitute an increase in information in the genome. For further information about this, I recommend having a look at Don Exodus's video about information in the genome, where he describes frameshift mutations which clearly add information to the genome. Hopefully between all of these videos we can clear up the ridiculous misconception that that mutations can't increase information in the genome. Thanks for listening.